Welcome to the Timeless Voice, where history speaks and you listen. In today's journey, we step into the heart of one of the most fascinating empires in human history, the Ottoman Empire. From grand mosques and royal feasts to ancient poetry and powerful sultans, we'll uncover the rich culture, art, science, and everyday life that shaped centuries of the world. And as always, this isn't just a history lesson, it's a chance to learn English naturally by listening to beautiful flowing storytelling. So sit back, relax, and let the past come alive in your ears. This is the Timeless Voice, and your journey starts now. The Ottoman Empire, also known as the Turkish Empire, was a massive imperial state that spanned large parts of Southeast Europe, Western Asia, and North Africa. It began in the late 13th century and lasted all the way into the early 20th century. It all started around the year 1299 in northwestern Anatolia, which is in modern-day Turkey. A Turkoman tribal leader named Osman I founded a small principality there. Over time, his successors expanded the territory across Anatolia and into the Balkans. By the mid-1000s, what began as a local beylik grew into a vast transcontinental empire. One of the most defining moments in Ottoman history was the conquest of Constantinople in 1453 by Mehmed the Conqueror, also known as Mehmed the Conqueror. This marked the end of the Byzantine Empire and established Constantinople, now called Istanbul, as the capital of the Ottoman Empire. From that point on, the Ottomans became a dominant force in the region, playing a central role in the interactions between Europe and the Middle East for over 600 years. The Ottoman Empire was incredibly diverse. It ruled over many different ethnic and religious communities, and it allowed a fair degree of autonomy through a system called the millet system. This meant that religious communities like Christians and Jews could govern their own affairs under Islamic law. During the reigns of Selim I and Suleiman the Magnificent, the empire reached its peak, becoming a global superpower politically, militarily, and economically. Now, for a long time, historians thought the Ottoman Empire started to decline after Suleiman's death. But more recent research suggests that wasn't really the case. The empire continued to thrive in many ways well into the 18th century, with a strong economy, a capable military, and a complex but effective government system. That said, the Ottomans did suffer a series of military defeats in the late 1700s and 1800s. This led to the loss of territory and the rise of nationalism in places like the Balkans, where new independent nations began to form. In the 19th century, the Ottomans tried to modernize with a series of reforms known as the Tanzimat. These reforms aimed to make the state more powerful and efficient. For a short time in 1876, the empire even experimented with a constitutional monarchy, but it didn't last. After a crisis in the east, Abdul Hamid II restored absolute monarchy. Later in the 19th century, a group of reformers known as the Young Turks pushed for more liberal and Western-style governance. In 1908, they led a revolution and re-established the constitutional monarchy. But things took a darker turn after the Balkan Wars, when the ruling Committee of Union and Progress became more nationalistic and seized power in a 1913 coup. During World War I, the empire sided with the Central Powers, and things went from bad to worse. There were internal revolts, including the Arab Revolt, and tragic events like the mass persecution of Armenians, Assyrians, and Greeks, which many historians recognize as genocides. After losing the war, the Ottoman Empire was occupied and eventually partitioned by the victorious Allied powers. This led to the Turkish War of Independence, and in 1923, under the leadership of Mustafa Kemal Ataturk, the Republic of Turkey was officially established, marking the end of the Ottoman Empire after more than 600 years of rule. Let's take a look at the history of the Ottoman Empire, a story that stretches over hundreds of years and encompasses dramatic shifts in power and culture. It all began around 1299 when the Turkish tribal leader Osman I established his principality in Anatolia. This was a time when the Rum Sultanate was weakening, and Anatolia was divided into many small Turkish states, known as the Anatolian Beyliks. Osman Nurar, whose name would eventually give rise to the Ottomans, led one of these small states in the region of Bithynia, which bordered the Byzantine Empire. Osman's early followers were a mix of Turkish tribes and renegades from the Byzantine Empire, many of whom converted to Islam. One of the key turning points early in the Ottomans' rise was their victory in the Battle of Baphius in 1302, which helped them gain control over several Byzantine towns along the Sakarya River. However, there's still a lot that isn't clear about how the Ottomans managed to overpower their neighbors. Over time, historians propose various theories, but one popular idea from the 20th century was the Gaza thesis, which suggested that the Ottomans were able to rally religious warriors to fight under the banner of Islam. But today, this theory isn't widely accepted, and no other theory has fully explained the empire's rapid rise. By the mid-14th century, the Ottomans had expanded significantly. Osman's son Orhan continued the conquest and captured the city of Bursa in 1326, which then became the Ottoman capital. This victory marked the end of Byzantine control in the region. As the Ottomans continued to push into the Balkans, they captured important territories like Thessaloniki from the Venetians in 1387, and the Battle of Kosovo in 1389 dealt a significant blow to Serbian power in the region, paving the way for Ottoman expansion into Europe. By 1396, the Ottomans were involved in the Battle of Nicopolis, which is considered one of the final, large-scale crusades of the Middle Ages. The Bulgarian Tsardom was defeated, and the Ottomans continued their advance, solidifying their presence in the Balkans. The rise of the Ottoman Empire surrounding the city. But Constantinople itself was a tough nut to crack, thanks to its strong defenses and strategic location on the Bosporus Strait. Then, in 1402, something unexpected happened. Timur, the famous Turco-Mongol leader and founder of the Timurid Empire, launched an invasion into Ottoman territory from the east. At the Battle of Ankara, he defeated the Ottomans and captured Sultan Bayezid I, plunging the empire into chaos. What followed was a civil war that lasted over a decade as Bayezid's sons fought for power. Eventually, in 1413, Mehmed I emerged victorious and managed to reunite the empire. After the dust settled, the Ottomans began to reclaim what they'd lost in the Balkans. Territories like Thessaloniki, Macedonia, and Kosovo were brought back under Ottoman control by Murad II during the 1430s and 1450s. In 1444, he defeated a major Crusader army made up of Hungarian, Polish, and Wallachian forces at the Battle of Varna. Although resistance continued, especially from the Albanians under Skanderbeg, Murad also crushed a second major offensive at the Battle of Kosovo in 1448. Now, historians today suggest that part of the reason for the Ottomans' rapid military expansion was actually the Black Death. The plague had devastated many parts of Europe, especially the Byzantine territories, leaving them weakened and more vulnerable to conquest. And on top of that, the Ottomans relied heavily on slave hunting, known as Akinji raids, as a major source of economic and military strength. Some researchers break down the conquest of the Balkans into phases, with these raids being a key feature for decades before the region was fully integrated into the empire. Now let's talk about the Ottoman Golden Age, starting with the dramatic fall of Constantinople. In 1453, Mehmed the Conqueror took charge. He restructured both the government and the military, and on May 29th, he finally did what many before him had failed to do. He captured Constantinople. With that victory, the Byzantine Empire was no more. Mehmed didn't just destroy what was left, He also made smart political moves. He allowed the Eastern Orthodox Church to keep its land and operate freely as long as it recognized Ottoman rule. And interestingly, many of the Orthodox people actually preferred Ottoman rule to that of Western European powers like Venice. Albanian resistance still posed a challenge, particularly when it came to Ottoman ambitions in Italy, but the empire was now entering its peak era. Throughout the 15th and 16th centuries, the Ottomans expanded rapidly. Thanks to strong leadership from a series of capable sultans and their control of major trade routes between Europe and Asia, the empire grew both militarily and economically. One of the most important rulers of this era was Sultan Selim Bey, who ruled from 1512 to 1520. He expanded the empire eastward by defeating the Safavid Empire at the Battle of Chaldiran. Then he turned south, defeating the Mamluk Sultanate and bringing Egypt under Ottoman control. With this victory, the Ottomans also gained influence over the Red Sea. After Selim came Suleiman the Magnificent, who ruled from 1520 to 1566. Under his leadership, the empire reached its greatest territorial extent. He captured Belgrade in 1521 and crushed the Hungarian forces at the Battle of Mohacs in 1526. Afterward, much of present-day Hungary became Ottoman territory. He even laid siege to Vienna in 1529, but didn't succeed in taking the city. A second attempt in 1532 also failed, though the Ottomans continued to dominate Central Europe for some time. To the east, the Ottomans captured Baghdad in 1535, gaining control of Mesopotamia and access to the Persian Gulf. And in 1555, the Peace of Amasya split control of the Caucasus between the Ottomans and the Safavids. The Ottomans took western Armenia, parts of Kurdistan, and western Georgia, while the Safavids held onto eastern Armenia, Georgia, and parts of modern-day Azerbaijan. Meanwhile, Ottoman forces were making moves in the Mediterranean. In 1539, a 60-strong Ottoman army captured the Spanish garrison at Castelnuovo. It was a costly battle, but it forced Venice to surrender most of its Aegean holdings in 1540. The French and Ottomans even formed an alliance against their shared rival, the Habsburgs, working together on several campaigns. One of the most famous collaborations happened in 1543, when French forces and Ottoman admirals Hayreddin Barbarossa and Draga joined up to capture Nice and later Corsica. The French even helped with artillery support during the Ottoman capture of Esztergom in Hungary. Eventually, even the Habsburgs had to recognize Ottoman dominance in Hungary. That recognition came in 1547. And when Suleiman died in 1566, during the siege of Sigedvar, the empire was still at its height, stretching across 3 continents and covering over 2 million square kilometers. The Ottomans also became a dominant naval force. They controlled much of the Mediterranean and were deeply involved in global politics, especially in the religious wars between Christians and Muslims. As leaders of the Islamic world, they went head-to-head with Spain and Portugal, who had united under the Iberian Union and were leading Christian crusades worldwide. The two powers clashed not just in Europe, but across the Indian Ocean, and even into Southeast Asia. The Ottomans supported the Muslim Sultanate of Aceh in Indonesia, while the Iberians tried to dominate the seas and spread Christianity using the Philippines as a base. In the Mediterranean, Barbary pirates from Ottoman-controlled cities like Algiers, Tunis, and Tripoli raided European towns and ships, capturing people and goods. These corsairs caused serious disruption to European trade. By the 1600s, the global rivalry between the Ottoman Caliphate and the Iberian Union had reached a stalemate. Both were roughly equal in power, technology, and influence. Still, many European thinkers of the time, like Francesco Sansovino and Jean Bodin, compared the strength of the Ottoman Empire to that of ancient Rome. Let's dive into a time of transformation and resilience for the Ottoman Empire, a period once mistakenly labeled as stagnant. From 1566 to 1827, The empire weathered internal pressures and external threats, and despite the challenges, it kept adapting, reforming, and asserting itself on the world stage. The price of power. By the late 1500s, both Europe and the Middle East were grappling with rising inflation and the skyrocketing costs of warfare. These financial strains hit the Ottoman Empire hard, triggering a series of crises around the year 1600. The empire had to change. It restructured its political and military systems to stay relevant, which helped it remain a strong economic and military force well into the 17th century. Historians used to call this period one of decline, but today, most agree that it was actually a time of transformation and adaptation. A shifting trade landscape. Meanwhile, European powers have found new trade routes by sea, bypassing Ottoman-controlled land routes. The Portuguese made a bold move around Africa's southern tip in 1488, sparking a naval rivalry with the Ottomans in the Indian Ocean. Still, Ottoman trade didn't slow down. In fact, cities like Cairo thrived, especially with the rise of coffee. As coffee houses popped up everywhere, Cairo became a hub for this increasingly popular drink. East meets East, and clashes over in the East. Russia was expanding under Ivan the Terrible. In 1571, the Ottomans and their Crimean allies struck back, even managing to burn Moscow. But the Russians pushed back the next year. The Crimean Khanate, an Ottoman vassal, kept launching raids into Eastern Europe, remaining a major regional power through the 17th century. War in Cyprus and the Mediterranean. In 1570, the Ottomans turned their attention to Cyprus, a Venetian stronghold. After a bloody siege, they captured Nicosia and Famagusta, though at great cost. Over 50 Ottomans died. Meanwhile, in 1571, the Holy League, a European alliance led by Spain and Venice, scored a big win at the Battle of Lepanto, sinking about 200 Ottoman ships and killing tens of thousands of men. It was a symbolic blow to Ottoman dominance at sea, though the empire quickly rebuilt its navy and regained control in North Africa. Fighting on multiple fronts on the European frontier, things got messy. The long Turkish War with Austria between 1593 and 6 their ground. They suffered serious losses in the east. Persia's Safavid dynasty reclaimed much of the Caucasus during a series of wars in the early 1600s. Later, Venice lost Crete to the Ottomans, but only after a brutal decades-long war that cost tens of thousands of lives on both sides. Central power restored. Briefly, Murad IV came to power in the early 1600s and brought back central authority. In 1639, he recaptured Iraq from the Safavids, and a treaty that year split the Caucasus between the Ottomans and Persians. Around this time, the Sultanate of Women saw powerful royal mothers guiding the empire through their sons. Qasem Sultan and Turhan Hadis were the era's standout figures, although their rivalry ended in tragedy. The Kopruli comeback from 1656 to 1703, the Kopruli family of Grand Viziers helped restore order and win new battles, taking back Transylvania and even parts of Ukraine. But that momentum came crashing down in 1683. The disaster at Vienna that year, the Ottomans made a bold move. They laid siege to Vienna again, but they hesitated at the worst moment. Allied European forces, led by Poland's King John III Sobieski, crushed the Ottoman army. The defeat marked the beginning of the end for Ottoman dominance in Europe. The Treaty of Karlowitz in 1699 forced the empire to give up a lot of territory. The 1700s holding the line throughout the 1700s, the Ottomans managed to hold on to most of their European borders, except for a few losses like the Banat region. But Russia was becoming a bigger threat. When Sweden's King Charles II fled to the Ottoman Empire after losing to Russia, the Ottomans briefly turned the tables. They even won a war against Russia in 1711, but it didn't last. Treaties with Austria and Russia in the 1700s slowly chipped away. At Ottoman territory, even so, the empire entered a rare period of peace. New schools opened, including the future Istanbul Technical University, in 1726. The printing press finally got the green light, thanks to a man named Ibrahim Mutafarrika. North Africa and Russia's rise, the Ottomans lost control of Oran in Algeria to Spain, and later, Russia sparked another war by supporting rebels who destroyed the town of Balta. The Russo-Turkish War that followed ended in 1774 with the Treaty of Küçükçayırca, giving religious freedoms to Christians in the empire and exposing just how far behind the Ottomans had fallen compared to Russia. The Janissary problem and reform in the late 1700s, Sultan Selim III tried to modernize the military, but the Janissaries, who had grown corrupt and powerful, refused to change. They eventually revolted, killing Selim and halting reforms. His successor Mahmud II responded with brutal force, wiping out the Janissary corps in 1826. Revolts and rebellions, the Balkans were awakening. Serbia revolted from 1804 to 1815. In 1821, Greece rose up too, winning independence by 1830. Meanwhile, the Wahhabis in Arabia challenged Ottoman rule, forcing the empire to call on Egypt's Muhammad Ali Pasha. He defeated the rebels, but later turned against the Ottomans himself, nearly taking Constantinople. Muhammad Ali and the Ottoman crisis. By the early 1830s, Muhammad Ali had seized parts of Syria and Lebanon. The Ottomans had to ask Russia for help to stop him. A treaty saved the day, but it also marked a new era, one where the empire needed outside help to survive. A second war followed, and this time Britain and Austria stepped in to help the Ottomans win back control. The sick man of Europe. By the mid-1800s, the Ottoman Empire had earned an unfortunate nickname, the sick man of Europe. And it wasn't far off. Former provinces like Serbia, Wallachia, and Moldavia were all moving toward full independence. The decline and modernization of the Ottoman Empire, 1828–1908. Let's take a step back to the mid-1800s, a time when the Ottoman Empire was undergoing a wave of major changes. This era, known as the Tanzimat period, roughly between 1839 and 1876, was a time of intense reform and modernization. The Ottoman government tried to reshape itself by introducing a series of reforms. They set up a modern conscripted army, revamped the banking system, decriminalized homosexuality, and began replacing religious law with secular legal codes. Guilds were being replaced by modern factories, and in 1840, the Ministry of Post was established in Istanbul. Interestingly, Samuel Morse, yes, the guy behind the telegraph, received an Ottoman patent for his invention in 1847. Sultan Abdülmecid himself tested the telegraph. Things reached a peak with the 1876 constitution, known as the Kanun-u Esasi. It marked the beginning of the first constitutional era. But, unfortunately, that new parliament only lasted 2 years before the Sultan pulled the plug and suspended it. Meanwhile, a significant shift was happening in the empire's population. Christian communities, thanks to better access to education, started gaining a social and economic edge over the Muslim majority. By 1861, there were over 570 primary schools and nearly 100 secondary schools for Christians, serving around 140 students. In contrast, Muslim education was hampered by a heavy focus on Arabic and Islamic theology. Historian Norman Stone even pointed out that the Arabic script used for Turkish at the time made learning harder for Turkish children. This educational advantage allowed many Christians to rise economically. For example, by 1911, most of Istanbul's wholesale businesses, 528 out of 654, were owned by ethnic Greeks. On top of that, many Christians and Jews gained foreign citizenship or protection, meaning they didn't have to follow the same economic rules as Muslim Ottomans. The cost of war and the rise of debt. The mid-19th century was also a time of geopolitical struggle. The Crimean War from 1853 to 1856 was part of a larger power play among European nations vying for influence over Ottoman lands. The war drained the empire financially. To fund it, the Ottomans borrowed heavily, issuing loans worth £5 million in 1854. These conflicts also triggered massive migrations. Around 200 Crimean Tatars fled to the Ottoman Empire. Later, about 90% of the Circassian population was expelled from the Caucasus, and between 500 to 700 of them resettled in Ottoman lands. While refugees like the Crimean Tatars played key roles in promoting education and Turkish nationalism, the state itself spent very little on education, only about 0.2% of the budget in the early 1860s. Instead, the empire became increasingly reliant on foreign debt. By 1875, it was bankrupt. In 1881, a council dominated by Europeans, the Ottoman Public Debt Administration, took control of the empire's finances, ensuring European capital flowed in, often at the expense of local interests. Territorial losses and ethnic tensions back home. Things were tense. In 1876, the Ottoman army violently crushed the Bulgarian uprising, killing up to 100 people. Just a year later, in the Russo-Turkish War of 1877-1878, the empire lost large chunks of its European territory. Bulgaria gained autonomy, Romania and Serbia became fully independent, and Austria-Hungary moved in to occupy Bosnia and Herzegovina. Britain also expanded its control, taking over Cyprus in 1878 and later Egypt in 1882 after a local uprising. Sultan Abdul Hamid II was so afraid of being overthrown that he avoided mobilizing his army, fearing it could spark a coup. Still, he understood the need for military reform, so in 1883, he invited a German general, Baron von der Goltz, to train Ottoman officers. This gave rise to the so-called Goltz generation, a group of well-trained soldiers who would become important players in the empire's final years. Sadly, this period also witnessed the brutal Hamidian massacres from 1894 to 1896, in which as many as 300 Armenians were killed. By 1897, the empire's population was about 19 million, mostly Muslims, but the Sultan's actual authority was mass displacement of Muslims and non-Muslims alike. It's estimated that between 1821 and 1922, around 5 million Muslims died in southeastern Europe due to war, exile, or massacres. Defeat and the fall of the empire, 1908-1902. By 1908, the empire was struggling to survive, but that year brought hope with the Young Turk Revolution. This movement restored the Ottoman constitution and ushered in a new era of multi-party politics. People believed this could modernize the empire and ease ethnic tensions. Sadly, that dream quickly turned into a bitter struggle for survival. Parties like the Committee of Union and Progress, CUP, rose to prominence. Meanwhile, nationalist and ethnic parties gained traction too. Austria-Hungary seized this moment of unrest and annexed Bosnia and Herzegovina in 1908. Around this time, military reforms were underway, but the Ottomans still lost North Africa and nearly all of their European land in the Italo-Turkish and Balkan Wars. World War I, and total collapse. Then came World War I. The Ottomans joined the Central Powers and launched a surprise attack on Russia in 1914. That move triggered declarations of war from Russia, Britain, and France. Despite early victories like the defense of Gallipoli and success in Mesopotamia, the tide soon turned. The Arab Revolt of 1916, supported by Britain, was a game-changer. In the Caucasus, the Ottomans struggled against Russia until the Russian Revolution pulled them out of the war in 1917. But the darkest chapter came in 1915, The Armenian Genocide. Over 1 million Armenians were killed through mass deportations, starvation, and massacres. Similar atrocities were committed against Greek and Assyrian minorities as part of a brutal campaign of ethnic cleansing. The end of empire after World War I. The Ottoman Empire was defeated. The Armistice of Mudros was signed in 1918. Istanbul was occupied by Allied forces, and Greece seized control of parts of western Anatolia. In 1920, the Treaty of Sèvres carved up the empire. But in response, a nationalist movement emerged, led by Mustafa Kemal, later known as Ataturk. His leadership sparked the Turkish War of Independence. By 1922, the Sultanate was officially abolished. The last Sultan, Mehmed V, went into exile, and on October 29, 1923, the Republic of Turkey was born, with Ankara as its capital. A few months later, in March 1924, the Caliphate was also abolished, marking the final chapter in the centuries-old story of the Ottoman Empire. When we look at the Ottoman Empire, historians have had a lot to say, especially about how it developed and what kind of legacy it carried from earlier empires. Some scholars, like the British historian Edward Gibbon and the Greek historian Dimitri Kitsikis, believe that after Constantinople fell, the Ottomans didn't just take the city, they basically inherited the Byzantine state machinery. They saw the Ottoman Empire as a kind of continuation of the Byzantine Empire, just under a Turkish Muslim identity. Another take comes from American historian Spiros Vryanis. He described the early Ottoman system as being deeply rooted in Byzantine and Balkan traditions, with Islam and the Turkish language layered on top. Interestingly, Kitsikis, along with historian Heath Lowry, painted the early Ottomans not as religious conquerors, but as a loose alliance of Christians and Muslims looking for loot and slaves. According to them, religion wasn't the main motivator at the beginning. Islam only became a defining feature later on, but not everyone agrees with that. Another group of historians, led by Austrian scholar Paul Wittek, argued the opposite, that the Ottoman Empire was very much an Islamic jihad state from the start, with the goal of expanding the Muslim world. Then there's the Gaza thesis, supported by Turkish historian Mehmet Fuat Köprülü in 1937. He suggested that the early Ottoman way of life reflected the traditions of nomadic Turkic tribes who had traveled from East Asia to Anatolia. According to this view, Persian culture had the biggest influence on how the Ottoman state took shape. British historian Norman Stone also highlighted many similarities between the Byzantine and Ottoman systems. For example, the Ottoman land tax Rezimite shift had its roots in the Byzantine Zurgarian tax. The land grant system known as Timar resembled the Byzantine pronoia. Even their units of land measurement were basically the same. However, Stone also pointed out a key difference. Under the Ottomans, land grants weren't originally hereditary, and even when they became inheritable, the Sultan could revoke them at any time. This instability discouraged long-term investment and led landholders to focus on short-term gain, which hurt the empire's economy over time. Shift to government now. Before the big reforms of the 1900s, the Ottoman Empire had two main branches of government, the military and the civil administration. At the top of it all was the Sultan. The civil system was based on local regions, and while the Ottomans borrowed a lot from Islamic Iran, they still held onto some older Turkish traditions. The goal of the state was simple but powerful: defend Muslim lands, expand its territory, and maintain peace and order according to Islamic principles. What made the Ottoman dynasty unique, even in the Islamic world, was its incredible longevity. The House of Osman ruled from the late 1200s to the early 1900s, longer than most dynasties in history. Even Europe's famous Habsburgs couldn't match them in terms of an unbroken line of rulers. And although there were a few palace coups and 11 sultans were deposed, the ruling family stayed intact. The final Ottoman, Sultan Mehmed V, could trace his ancestry directly back to the first sultan, Osman Ayad. That kind of continuity was rare, both in Europe and in the Islamic world. The imperial harem, by the way, wasn't just about palace intrigue. Its main role was to ensure male heirs for the throne, continuing the dynasty through the male line. Despite the strong central authority, local governors often acted independently, sometimes even against the sultan's will. After the Young Turk Revolution in 1908, the empire became a constitutional monarchy. The sultan lost his executive powers, and a parliament was formed, representing various provinces. You can even see the empire's diversity in its diplomatic practices. For instance, they used the Greek language in official correspondence with the West for quite a while. Then, there were the tughra, the elaborate calligraphic signatures of the sultans. These weren't just scribbles, they were works of art that represented the power and legacy of the sultan and his father. Shift to law. When it came to law, the Ottomans had a fascinating mix of systems. On one hand, you had religious law, Sharia. On the other, you had dynastic law, called Qanun, which coexisted with Sharia. The legal system was deeply rooted in local practices and aimed to balance central authority with local needs. And because the empire was so diverse, the legal framework had to be flexible enough to accommodate various cultures and religions. There were three types of courts: one for Muslims, one for non-Muslims, where Jews and Christians governed their own communities, and one for commercial disputes. But these lines weren't always rigid. Non-Muslims often used Islamic courts when they wanted a stronger ruling. Sharia itself was based on the Quran, the Hadith, community consensus, analogy from past rulings and local customs. Judges, called qadis, played a key role but didn't always follow precedent. Instead, they often leaned on local customs to resolve cases. Now, the court system didn't have appeal, so if someone didn't like a verdict, they'd sometimes hop from court to court until they got the ruling they wanted. In the 1800s, the Ottoman legal system went through big reforms. It all started with the Edict of Gülhane in 1839. This led to fair public trials, legal equality regardless of religion, and formal civil codes. These changes were largely inspired by French legal models and introduced a three-level court system called the Nizamiya. Eventually, religious matters were handled by religious courts, while civil matters went to the new state courts. The legal landscape had changed dramatically. Shift to military. Let's talk about the military, because that's where the Ottomans really made their mark early on. The first Ottoman army was formed by Osman I in the late 1200s from tribesmen in western Anatolia. Over time, the military became highly structured. There were elite infantry like the Janissaries, cavalry units like the Sipahi, raiders called akinji, and even military bands known as Mehteran. The Ottomans were ahead of their time in warfare. They were among the first to use muskets and cannons, like the Mashri, when Sultan Mahmud II disbanded the outdated Janissary Corps and built a new, modern army called the Nizam-o-Sedid. This was also when the Ottomans began bringing in foreign military advisors and sending their officers abroad for training, leading to the rise of the Young Turks. Naval power was another story. In the 1500s, the Ottoman Navy was crucial in expanding the empire, especially into North Africa. But by the 1800s, it had declined. Sultan Abdulaziz tried to revive it, building one of the world's largest fleets, but the economy couldn't keep up. His successor, Abdulhamid II, mistrusted the admirals and let the ships rot in the harbor. Finally, in the early 1900s, the Young Turks tried again, launching a national campaign to rebuild the navy with public support. Even military aviation had its place. Between 1909 and 1911, the Ottomans began training their first pilots. By 1912, they had founded the aviation school, and by World War I, their squadrons were flying missions from Europe to the Middle East. Economy. The Ottomans didn't just conquer cities, they built them up. Cities like Bursa, Edirne, and Istanbul, each at one time the empire's capital, were intentionally the empire's capital, were intentionally developed into economic and industrial hubs. The sultans recognized that merchants and artisans weren't just workers, they were the lifeblood of a thriving metropolis. To boost this vision, Sultan Mahmud and his successor Bayezid actively welcomed Jewish communities fleeing persecution in Europe, especially after events like the Spanish Reconquista. These migrants found safety and opportunity in cities like Istanbul and Salonika, where the empire's tolerant stance made it a haven. The Ottoman understanding of economics was deeply intertwined with its broader philosophy of governance. For them, a strong state meant a prosperous, orderly society, and that meant making sure the productive classes, farmers, artisans, and merchants, were doing well. Their goal was to grow state revenues without harming the well-being of the people, preserving social balance and avoiding unrest. This approach worked for a time. During the early modern period, the Ottoman economy expanded significantly. From 1523 to 1748, the empire's income, adjusted for inflation, quadrupled. Behind this success was an effective financial bureaucracy known as the men of the pen. This scribal class, often made up of highly trained religious scholars or ulama, managed the empire's treasury and chancery better than any other Islamic state at the time. Their professionalism was a key factor behind the achievements of many famous Ottoman statesmen. But change was coming. As European powers like Portugal, Spain, and later Britain opened new sea routes, the old land-based trade networks that once made the Ottomans wealthy began to lose significance. Western Europe's shift to oceanic trade meant the Ottomans were slowly being bypassed. Treaties like the 1838 Anglo-Ottoman Treaty, also known as the Treaty of Balta-Liman, further exposed the empire's markets to competition from European powers. Even though the state tried to develop trade routes, cultivate new land, and encourage commerce, Ottoman administrators remained locked in older economic worldviews. They didn't fully grasp or adopt the capitalist or mercantile models transforming Europe. This left them vulnerable. According to economic historian Paul Bayrock, their commitment to free trade, combined with a failure to protect local industries, led to deindustrialization. Unlike countries like China, Japan, or even Spain, which practiced protectionism, the Ottoman Empire remained open to foreign imports, partly due to treaties called capitulations dating back to 1536 with France. These agreements gave foreign merchants extremely low customs duties, sometimes just 3%, further undercutting local industry. British economists praised this openness in the early 19th century, but others, including Prime Minister Benjamin Disraeli, would later criticize it, pointing to the empire as a cautionary tale about the dangers of unregulated free trade. Demographics estimating the Ottoman Empire's population isn't easy, especially before the 19th century. One method, based on tithe registers from 1520 to 1535, puts the population around 11.7 million. Strangely, the population in the 1700s was actually lower than in the 1500s, for reasons historians still debate. The first official census came in 1831, but it only counted potential male conscripts, so the numbers are a serious undercount. By around 1800, though, the empire's population had grown again, reaching between 25 and 32 million. Of that, about 10 million lived in Europe, mostly in the Balkans, 11 million in Asia, and 3 million in Africa. Densities were higher in the European provinces, which were about twice as populated as Anatolia and significantly denser than Iraq, Syria, or Arabia. Life expectancy toward the end of the empire was around 49 years, fairly high for the time, compared to just the mid-20s in Serbia in the early 1800s. But epidemics and famines were a constant threat. The 1812-1819 plague alone killed over 300 people. In Egypt, A sixth of the population died in 1785 from plague. Between 1687 and 1731, 6 famines struck Egypt. Anatolia had its last major famine around the 1770s. Urbanization also transformed the demographic landscape. The rise of steamships and railroads drew people to port cities. Salonika, in today's Greece, grew from 55,000 people in 1800 to 160,000 by 1912. Izmir doubled in size during the same period. Other places, like Belgrade, saw population declines due to wars and political upheaval. Mass migrations also reshaped the empire. As Russia and the Habsburgs annexed areas like Crimea and the Balkans, waves of Muslim refugees fled into Ottoman lands. Between 1783 and 1913, up to 7 million refugees arrived, including over 1 million North Caucasian Muslims between the 1850s and World War I. These migrations had major impacts demographically, economically, and politically. The loss of artisans and farmers affected regional economies, while resettled communities sometimes created long-term tensions, like those between Turkey and Bulgaria. By 1922, half of urban Turkey's population was descended from Muslim refugees from Russia, known as muhasir. Language. The official language of the empire was Ottoman Turkish, a variant of Oghuz Turkic heavily influenced by Persian and Arabic. The educated elite, especially in government and the military, used a version filled with foreign terms. Meanwhile, the everyday language of ordinary Turks had fewer of these influences. From its early days, Turkish was used for administration and the military. This status was confirmed in the 1876 constitution, but the empire was multilingual. Turkish was widely spoken in Anatolia and the Balkans. Persian, while not widely spoken, was the literary language of scholars. Arabic dominated in Egypt, Arabia, Iraq, and North Africa. French became the go-to language for educated elites in the 19th century. Literacy remained low, just 2–3% in the early 1800s and only about 15% by century's end. People often hired arzu halsis, or petition writers, to communicate with the government. Many ethnic minorities spoke Turkish as a second language, and in diverse villages it was common for neighbors to speak each other's tones. Religion. Sunni Islam was the dominant religion of the Ottoman Empire. The sultans followed the Hanafi school of Islamic law and the Maturidi school of theology, which encouraged rationalism, philosophy, and even science. Most Ottoman rulers were also Sufis, drawn to mystical paths like the Mevlevi and Bektashi orders. While Muslims dominated, the empire was religiously diverse. Christians and Jews lived throughout the empire. Until the late 15th century, Christians were actually the majority. Even into the 19th century, non-Muslims were still a significant minority, 19%. By 1914, under the dhimmi system, Jews and Christians were allowed to worship freely, own property, and run their own communities. But they paid higher taxes and had legal limitations. Over time, many converted to Islam for social mobility. Those who didn't lived under the millet system, which gave religious communities autonomy. The Greek Orthodox Rum millet was led by the ecumenical patriarch and governed by Byzantine law. Jews answered to the Haham Bashi, the chief rabbi, and Armenians to their own church hierarchy. Despite limitations, Jews and Christians were often economically and politically influential, particularly in commerce and administration. Some scholars even describe the millet system as an early form of religious pluralism. Education in the Ottoman Empire wasn't just about reading and writing. It played a major role in shaping the values and worldview of society. The primary centers of learning were the madrasas, Islamic schools that were often attached to mosques. These schools focused on religious studies, of course, but they also taught a wide range of subjects like philosophy, astronomy, medicine, and mathematics. Access to education wasn't universal, though. It was mostly boys from urban and elite families who had consistent access to formal schooling. Girls were educated more informally, usually at home, but some learned to read and write as well, especially in upper-class families. Later, during the Tanzimat reform period in the 19th century, the Ottomans began to modernize education. New secular schools were established, modeled after Western systems, and they placed more emphasis on science, engineering, and military training. Ottoman literature was a rich blend of styles and languages. While Turkish was the main spoken language, much of the empire's elite literature was written in Persian or Arabic, especially early on. Poetry was a dominant form, not just as an art, but as a way of showcasing intellect and status. Poets wrote about love, mysticism, power, and nature, often using elaborate metaphors and symbolism. One of the most famous Ottoman poets was Bakshi, who lived during the reign of Suleiman the Magnificent. His verses are still admired today for their depth and beauty. Prose also had its place, especially in historical chronicles, travelogues, and religious writings. Over time, more works were written in Turkish, helping to shape a unique Ottoman literary voice. Media in the early Ottoman centuries, media mostly meant oral storytelling, handwritten manuscripts, and poetry recitals. Public readings and performances were common, and news spread through town criers and word of mouth. The printing press came relatively late to the empire, mostly due to religious and political concerns. It wasn't until the 18th century that printed books became more widespread, and even then, they were primarily in non-Muslim communities. By the 19th century, with reforms and Western influence, newspapers and journals began to emerge in Turkish and other languages of the empire. These publications played a growing role in public life, shaping opinion and spreading new ideas. Ottoman architecture is one of the empire's most lasting legacies. Inspired by both Byzantine and Islamic traditions, it produced some of the world's most iconic buildings. The most famous architect of the empire was Mimar Sinan, who served under 3 sultans. His masterpieces, like the Süleymaniye Mosque in Istanbul, combine grandeur with delicate design. He perfected the use of domes, arches, and minarets in ways that still influence Islamic architecture today. Mosques, palaces, baths, and public fountains weren't just functional buildings. They were symbols of the empire's power, spirituality, and sophistication. Decorative art. The Ottomans had a deep appreciation for beauty and detail, which showed in their decorative arts. Calligraphy, tilework, metalwork, and textiles were all elevated to high art. Calligraphy, in particular, was seen as a sacred art form because of its use in copying the Quran. Artists developed intricate scripts and designs, often adorning walls, domes, and even everyday objects with beautiful writing. Iznik tiles, with their rich blues and reds, became a hallmark of Ottoman style. They were used to decorate mosques, palaces, and homes, turning walls into vibrant works of art. Music and performance art. Music was an essential part of life in the Ottoman Empire, from the Sultan's court to street performers in the markets. Ottoman classical music combined Persian, Arabic, and Turkish influences and followed a unique system of modes known as makam. Musicians performed with instruments like the oud, ney, and kanun, creating complex, emotional pieces that could be both spiritual and entertaining. There were also public performances of shadow puppetry, particularly the famous Karagöz and Hasabat plays, which used humor and satire to comment on daily life, politics, and culture. Cuisine. Ottoman cuisine reflected the empire's diversity. It was a blend of Central Asian, Middle Eastern, Mediterranean, and Balkan influences, and food was a big part of both daily life and celebration. The royal kitchens of the Topkapi Palace were legendary. They employed hundreds of cooks preparing lavish feasts for the sultans, featuring dishes like pilafs, kebabs, stews, and an impressive variety of sweets, especially baklava. Coffee also became a major cultural fixture in the Ottoman world. Coffee houses popped up in cities across the empire, becoming popular spots for conversation, reading, and social life. Sports. The Ottomans valued physical strength and skill. One of the oldest and most traditional sports was oil wrestling, where competitors, covered in olive oil, grappled in open fields. This sport still survives today in modern Turkey. Archery, horsemanship, and hunting were also popular, especially among the military elite. These weren't just pastimes, they were tied to warrior culture and discipline. Later, during the modernization period, European-style sports like football, soccer, and gymnastics began to catch on, especially in urban centers. Science and technology. Throughout its early and classical periods, the Ottoman Empire made significant contributions to science and learning. Scholars in the empire studied everything from astronomy and medicine to mathematics and engineering. The Ottomans translated and built on earlier works from the Islamic Golden Age as well as classical Greek texts. They established observatories and libraries, and they produced some impressive maps and navigational tools, including the famous world map by Piri Reis, which showed surprising knowledge of global geography. In the 19th century, as Western science advanced, the Ottomans began to adopt modern technologies, building railways, telegraph lines, and modern schools for engineering and medicine, all in an effort to keep pace with a rapidly changing world. And that brings us to the end of this incredible journey through the culture, art, science, and daily life of the magnificent Ottoman Empire. We hope you not only discovered something new about history, but also improved your English by simply listening along. If you enjoyed this episode, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to The Timeless Voice, where history comes alive and English learning becomes effortless. Keep listening, keep learning, and most importantly, keep supporting. Your voice matters in The Timeless Voice. Until next time, take care and stay curious.